Thank you. I forgot the microphone. So today we are very excited to have Dr. Danica Miller, assistant professor at the School of... Nice crowd. Yes. From Social and Historical Studies, Division of School of Interdisciplinary Arts and Sciences. And we would like to congratulate Danica for winning the Distinguished Teachers Award. And Assistant Professor Danica Miller is a pioneer in the development of American Indian curriculum at UW Tacoma, where she has created multiple courses that support the minor in American Indian Studies. Dr. Miller's pedagogy emphasizes the Coast Salish approach to learning where experience, storytelling, repetition, and application are elevated as critical and credible ways of knowing. She developed the Lushootseed Language Institute in partnership with the Puyallup tribe, allowing students to engage with their cultural heritage on ancestral land. Dr. Miller's active learning approach challenges students while providing a safe place for them to speak and be heard. Her teaching not only highlights an underrepresented field of study, but engages students in a search for deeper understanding of how their lives relate to their own and other cultures. So it's all yours,
Okay.
Danica. Thank you.
Hashachel titsi ab. Danica Sterud Miller titsta spiolapish ched. Si ab Bill Sterud titsta I spiolapish. Carl William Sterud I tutsapa hidatspash. Marjorie Mathern Sterud titsta I tukaya spiolapish. Tutayag siayaya. What did I just do? I'm going to ask you guys questions because I'm not just going to talk. I'm just going to talk to you. I said welcome, yes, and then what did I do? And then I introduced myself, and how did I introduce myself?
By your family.
Yes, by my family lineage. So a few of you have already heard this story before, but I like to start out this way. Many of you have met my dad or seen my dad around campus, and my dad is like the world's biggest Husky fan. He's a huge Husky fan. And like many of us that were familiar with the story, for people who come from marginalized communities, my dad went to the UW for 2 years, but had to drop out for all the reasons that we're very familiar with here at UW-T. And from birth, my dad was determined that I was going to go to the UW, and talked about it all the time. He had a T-shirt that said, "My daughter and my money go to the UW." He was so ready for me to go to the UW. I was appalled. Like, all I saw at the UW was just this big football school, and I was somebody who wanted to read a book under trees. And I absolutely had no desire to go to the UW. So I went to Western for undergrad, went to Fordham for, and UW actually would have been a great school for me. But I went to Fordham for graduate school, and then now here I am at UW, probably forever, right? And the big joke is that my dad was playing the long con, because now he really has me here. But when I moved back to Tacoma, he gave me this medallion. And I'm going to hand this medallion around so you guys can look at it. I'm going to give it to the weirdo in the front row. And so I probably should have handed it out when I started the story. But as you're looking at the medallion, what are some things about this medallion that represent sort of the Puyallup? Anything you can say about it? How would you describe it, Ellen?
Well, I had a lot of beadwork.
Had a lot of beadwork on it, yes. And it was circular. So is beadwork, is that traditional for the Puyallup or Coast Salish peoples more generally? Absolutely not. Like, how would we have decorated ourselves? What was that?
Shells.
Shells, yes, shells. We did have beads that we used, we got through trade. They were pretty highly prized. But in general, it would be shells or feathers would be the way that we would have sort of decorated ourselves. We did sort of wear necklaces, but certainly not like the big medallion. And then what's in the middle of this big medallion? The husky, right? Which is also not traditional Coast Salish art. But what is it? What is traditional about that? Who said that? Yes, it's a gift, right? Because the Puyallup are the welcoming people, and like most Coast Salish peoples, and in fact many Indigenous peoples, gift giving is sort of our prime, one of our most highly prized traditions, right? So what I'm sort of going to be talking about today is how to incorporate these feelings, right? This sort of these Coast Salish epistemologies, these ways of thinking into our pedagogy, not just sort of the pretty stuff, not like the beadwork, not the baskets, right? But the way that we understand each other. Right? Let's see what's on my PowerPoint. Yes. All right, let's name some of the Indigenous peoples of now Washington State. Just shout them out. Quickly. You guys are doing excellent. Yes, keep going. Quileute, Swinomish, Colville, Yakima, yes. Spokane, Quinault. Yeah. Can you think of any non-recognized ones? Duwamish, yes. Chehalis. And we're not going to talk really about recognition today or at all, but I always think it's important to bring that out there, that we have many unrecognized Indigenous communities as well. And what does it mean to be Indigenous? Does anybody, any idea what I mean when I bring that phrase out? There's probably a billion different ways to define it. For the purposes of my classes in general and my work and for today, I define it as a land-based people, spiritual, cultural, political, that have been traumatized by settler colonialism. So traumatized in that they've been removed from their spiritual, cultural beliefs. Physically, almost in all cases. All right. And what are some of the ways local Indigenous communities express their indigeneity? Language. Trying to, right? What else? Pardon? Canoe Journey, yes. Who went to Canoe Journey this year? I know Ellen did, Mike, Ariana, Jim. This guy, who's this guy? Yes, Canoe Journey, which was fantastic and probably one of the best days of my life. Yeah, right? They really brought it. What is that? And fishing, yes. Anything else?
Art in general.
Art in general. Can you be more specific? What kind of songs, dance, all of which sort of go back to language, right? Sweats, carvings, yeah. You guys know like almost as much as my students, I think. Okay, and what were the educational methods of Indigenous education before settler colonialism? What were some of the ways that we taught each other and our children? Storytelling, absolutely. What else? Intergenerational. So can you give it more of an example?
So passed down between different levels of the family and parents to children.
Yes, and for the Coast Salish, that's going to be pretty auntie and uncle would be the sort of those big responsibilities. What else?
Dance and art.
Dance and art. And especially especially for art, there's going to be mentorship, right? A lot of one-on-one. Anything else? Yes. And what do you mean? Can you be more specific?
Within each community, the traditions of the community.
And how would they be purposely passed on?
Presumably through repetition, stories, all these methods of justice.
Yes. Uh-huh.
Some emphasis on tradition.
And I think, a couple others that we're missing is through I guess I said mentorship, didn't I? Mentorship, storytelling. I don't know if I missed any. Ritual, yes, certainly. And hunting and fishing would be both ritualized and then not ritualized, be done casually, and then also in these sort of ceremonial sort of instances. And singing would be part of either ceremony or storytelling. Yes. And after settler colonialism, what happened after settler colonialism? Boarding schools, industrial-sized boarding schools. So we had the first boarding schools are going to start in about 1819 with the Indian Civilization Act, which is going to give money to churches in order to civilize American Indians. This is going to last on a much smaller scale until about the Civil War, and then after the Civil War, we have the rise of industrial-sized boarding schools. And what were the student learning goals of industrial boarding schools? Pardon? Indoctrination to what?
To the colonial powers way of thinking.
Right, to the way, so it's going to be, and what would that be? Or what were they trying to erase? Oh, so history, yes. Religion, spirituality.
Ways of stories, literally everything that people learn in order to reconstruct that as sort of image of white Christianity.
Right. So we're going to, it's, I've done, as you all know, or most of you know that, I grew up in this highly political family. We talked about, stuff like just Indigenous trauma at the dinner table pretty regularly. And I would say that the work that I've done on industrial boarding schools was by far the most difficult thing that I've ever had to process. Like crawling into bed with my kids at night, sort of difficult things to process. And this is, my grandma went to a boarding school. It's not like this was totally part of my family history. And it's so detrimental and was so detrimental to our people in ways that it's sort of unfathomable. It's important to remember that one of the main reasons that they started industrial boarding schools is because we still have a lot of indigenous resistance in the 1880s. And if you think like, what's the best way to destroy a people? Like you take their children, right? Which is exactly what they did. And they took children usually around age 5, but all the way to, we do have evidence of newborns being taken. Oftentimes they would never return. The death rates at Indigenous boarding schools are astronomical, up to 50% in many cases. And what this did, and it did a fairly thorough job, is it destroyed community, right? The kids would be gone. A community without kids, right? That's impossible. It destroyed language, and we also have a destroyed culture. It didn't teach, they weren't teaching students how to, be mathematicians. They were teaching students how to be servants, and then, of course, we also have endemic sexual and physical abuse. And it was pretty successful. So, taking these pieces together, what is the higher education experience for American Indians? I'm just going to read a little bit. Okay. A little less than 10% of American Indians hold a bachelor's degree. While there are many reasons for this abysmal average, educators in higher education cannot overlook their complicity in recreating colonialism in academia. Janice Gold rightly points out, it is obvious that there is not a there's not a universe we all live in, there is not a university in this country that is not built on what was once native land. We should reflect on this over and over and instead understand this fact as one fundamental point about the relationship of Indians to academia. Without consciously acknowledging our colonial past and present in our classrooms, Indigenous erasure continues. Academia profits off the land theft and genocide of American Indians. By creating classrooms that acknowledge our colonialism and work towards an understanding of American Indian sovereignty, academia helps to decolonize the power structures and build a space where American Indian students are welcomed. Critical literacy and its interrogation of dominant ideologies as a major component of university and education in the last 2 decades is undisputed, and yet the same interrogation of dominant narratives often neglects American Indians and American Indian tribes within the contemporary landscape. Within education, the words diversity and multiculturalism have become so prevalent as to render the terms almost meaningless. Diversity and multiculturalism are acknowledged as good things, but for why and for what outcomes is less clear. While I certainly support an inclusive classroom, but if American diversity implies striving toward a democratic ideal of equality as the goal of diverse representation, then conversely, for Indigenous peoples, as colonized peoples living on colonized land, democratic equality is impossible. Indigenous peoples have not, like other marginalized groups, been fighting for inclusion in the democratic imaginary, but rather for the right to remain distinct, sovereign, and tribal peoples. American Indians are generally included in most discussions on diversity and ethnicity, but for many American Indians, certainly most American Indians with personally recognized and acknowledged tribal community affiliations, American Indians are not only part of an ethnic group within the larger United States, but they are members of nations in an active state of settler colonization continually committed by the now United States. It is crucial when teaching American Indian tribal communities in the classroom that American Indian tribal communities are historicized within their Indigenous sovereignties, or we will only contribute to the continuation of Indigenous colonization. So, how then do we create an Indigenous space in our classroom? I suggest we do 2 things. Prioritize the Indigenous sovereignty of the land. For our institution, the easiest thing to do is to bring in the Treaty of Medicine Creek, which is what? Yeah, you can speak up a little louder.
So in 1854, the Nisqually and Puyallup tribal leaders had a treaty with Isaac Stevens to cede their territories in exchange for historical and hunting and fishing rights.
Yeah, I'll take it. That's great. I'm going to talk more about the Treaty of Medicine Creek in a little bit, but here's the opening, which it's again, this is like the thing that you can talk about. One of the things, but when we look at all of the nations that were represented here, right? It's not just we have Nisqually, Puyallup, Silicon, Squaxin, which is Squaxin Island, Snohomish, Sechus, Tepixen, Squatl, and Sahemoish tribes, bands of Indians. This paragraph, this opening of the Medicine Creek Treaty just blows my mind every time I read it. But this is where we have ancestral sovereignty, right? But this is where we have sovereignty as recognized as a Western, within a Western understanding of what nationhood is. Yes. And number 2. Work within the Indigenous teaching methods of our ancestors. So, what are some of the teaching strategies that I have used today so far? Asking questions, so like relying upon the knowledge of the community. Yes. Which also I think should speak to a type of like humility as well, like waiting for those types of, and not to be curious about the answers, right? What else? What else are some other methods? Yeah, Ruth? Yes, I told a story, right, about my family. Yes, so storytelling, absolutely. What else? Sarah? Yes, right. So it's not static. Is that a word? The word I want? Lettuce-in, right? It's going to be within the. It's going to be within a moment, that specific moment. Yes. Yeah, Leanne?
Using the space like that, just being behind the podium?
Yes. And if I had thought of it earlier, I sort of thought you guys would be all on the little like tables, but this would be such a perfect opportunity for like a circle, right? But yes, using the space. What else?
You brought an artifact.
And what did I have you do with the artifact? Yes, I had you all touch it, right? And this is, I think, one of the like detrimental things that Western education does is we don't touch things anymore, right? It's like everything is experienced either like through computers, right, or through talking, but it's not. You need to engage with it. I've been working a little bit with Von Bell, who is the artist on campus, one of our artists, and I teach an intro to indigeneity class, and it's a 100 level class, and by the nature of the class, it just really means that the first like 3 weeks are just like genocide, right? And the students who are they take the class because they know. They're sympathetic already, right? It's not like History 101, it's Indigenous History 101. So they know it's going to be sort of a downer, but they're just like, and then I had Vaughn come in one day, and she brought in clay, and then she brought in a bucket of sediment from the Puyallup River. And everybody made little sculptures with the clay that they dipped into the Puyallup River. And it like a third of the class was like, excuse me? And then the other third of the class, they were so excited, and they were just, some of them stayed after, and they still they made some really weird looking things, right? Like, I was like, I don't think you need to spend as much time on it. But like they were, just moving with their hands and sort of understanding what, bringing that feeling of indigeneity and of land into this creative space with their hands, really moved a lot of the students. Not all of them, but the ones that who needed that, right? Who needed that moment. So touch. Let's see. Yes, and finally, I began this with speaking in the shoot seed. Right, which is not necessarily, certainly that's just a thing that I can do, right? A little teeny bit, but it sort of allows a space for other people's voices, and for other perspectives. I think in this way, and also is very like humbling for me to begin as well in terms of teaching. Things I didn't do, but that I would have liked to have done. One is I would have liked it if everybody had gotten up and started moving around in these ways. Just even making my students get up and go into different groups across the classroom, I can see that they're learning in these great ways. Usually, like, we'll sort of go around the classroom and in other ways, but body movement, right? Students learn so much through their body. And then of course, what is harder to practice in the classroom, which is mentorship, right? How do I work one-on-one with students? And I do, and I try really hard, and I actually have a physical list of students that I keep next to my desk. So when I get those emails, like, do you have a student who can do this? Or do you have a couple students that can do that? I'm just like, oh, these are, because I kind of forget, or they blend, right? But that one-on-one mentorship is so incredibly important for Indigenous students, not just because, well, for all the reasons that we know about first-generation students, but also because we all come from sort of cultures, right, where you're used to having a woman or an uncle, I guess, in your life who's going to say, like, you know, who's going to be a little bit stern, and who's also going to be like, how are you going to go to graduate school? What are the 3 things you need to do? Who do we need to talk to? Let's work this out. Let's get on that website. Because I had a very kind professor who really took me up under her wing when I was in undergrad. But I didn't know anybody who'd gone to graduate school. It was just like the year I got my PhD, I was the only American Indian to get a PhD in the humanities. So this sort of work takes a lot of time, right? But at the same time, the rewards, like I said, 10% of us have a BA, right? It has to be one-on-one. It has to be that way. And then finally, and the most important one, which I didn't have us do, even though I've done this a couple times in SEED, but every time I do, it turns out that we engage in acts of, we won't talk about it, but so you guys, we have to go outside, right? Like, going outside is like that's how we're raised to learn. That's how Indigenous students learn, right? As you learn by, like, you know, you're suddenly getting the story about the salmon, or about the water, or about the roots, because you're walking around with your grandpa. These are how you get. This is how you learn. So bringing all these things together is going to increase our attainment of American Indian students. So, while this talk is primarily about creating and honoring Indigenous space in the higher education classroom, this is the thing we know. These teaching tools work especially well for Indigenous students, but guess what? They work really well for all students. I've had classes where about 50% of my students were Indigenous, which was amazing, right? I taught my AIM class with a student with 50% of them were Indigenous. But in general, I will say it's about 15 to 20%. The Indigenous student population at UW-T is at 2%, which has doubled since Dr. Michelle Montgomery and I began working here, which definitely does point to the power and importance of representation. The national average is at 1%. The Puyallup tribe has 5,000 members, so we clearly have a lot of outreach we can be doing. But studies show, and I certainly see proven again and again in my classes, that Indigenous teaching methods work for student learning. And again, those things are storytelling, touch, multilingual, body, using your body, mentorship, and then again, most important is to go outside. So now I'm just going to share a quick lesson with y'all about how to do this here they are. Go outside. So here's the Treaty of Medicine Creek. And I think that I'm teaching the Treaty of Medicine Creek next week. But I think that we should all be using it in our classes in one way or another. And so I'm going to give like a little lesson on how we could use the Treaty of Medicine Creek in our classrooms. You'd think that I'd have it memorized by now. But Treaty of Medicine Creek, treaty with the Nisqually, Puyallup, etc., 1854, December 26, 1854. Articles of Agreement and Convention made and concluded on the Shananam, or Medicine Creek, in the territory of Washington, this 26th day of December, in the year 1854, by Isaac I. Stevens, Governor and Superintendent of Indian Affairs of the said territory, on the part of the United States and the underside chiefs, headmen, delegates of the Nisqually, Puyallup, Silicon, Squaxin, Sahamish, Stitches, Tixpan, Nisquatl, and Sahawamish tribes and bands of Indians occupying. I love it when they just give up. They're like bands of Indians. Occupying the lands lying around the heads of Puget Sound and the adjacent inlets, who for the purpose of this treaty are to be regarded as one nation on behalf of said tribes and bands and duly authorized by them. So the Treaty of Medicine Creek, December 26, 1854. So at this point, we have about 1,000 settlers living in the coastal area. So Indigenous people outnumber settlers about 3 to 1. So Isaac Stevens and his team, they arrive in 1854 to very quickly make treaties with the Indigenous peoples. Stevens is a terrible person. I said that once at a talk at the Washington State History Museum, and people got really upset with me, and I was worried that my dad was gonna beat him up. It went there really quick. And then he emailed me 3 or 4 paragraphs on why Stevens was just a product of his time, but he was actually somebody who took advantage of his time to enact genocidal policies. Anyways, in 1850, we have the Oregon Donation Land Act. So up until this point, we have the Hudson Bay Company, we have settlers arriving really with the intent of trade. And people in this area, they were traders. They were like, this is great. You have cool stuff, I have cool stuff. Let's trade our cool stuff, right? Nothing within their sort of knowledge system was you're going to try to destroy our people, right? That was sort of outside of what they could conceive of, right? And I really think that the initial settlers weren't interested in that either, right? We very quickly have intermarriage, and the settlers were completely dependent upon the local Indigenous peoples, without which they would have either starved. They certainly wouldn't have been successful in their work here. We have the Oregon Donation Land Act, which is when basically this area becomes a territory of the United States, which of course is land that the United States had no right to grant, right? This is perfect settler colonialism, where they're creating a land area, or saying if you live here and you don't die, we'll give you the title to this land. What we really want you to do, though, of course, is to move Indians off of the land. So things very quickly, starting about 1850, are starting to become very violent, and a lot of clashes in this area. What's important about this story, this moment, is that there could be settlement, right? And it was fine. But once we have a type of colonial settlement, this is when things aren't fine. So what I'm trying to say is this was a method, a tool. This is something that would happen on purpose, right? It didn't have to be this way, but the United States government encouraged the colonialism and genocide of this area. So when the Treaty of Medicine Creek, the Puyallup, the Nisqually, Squaxin Island, they were all familiar with making treaties. Our treaties were oral treaties because we didn't have a writing system. The whole paper documentation of things was a weird thing, and I think it's still really weird. I still find that whole process very weird. It's written down, and thus it's true. And this is the type of treaty making that we have, where it is a type of writing down to legitimize what was illegal, what is a type of theft, right? The Stevens men had been living close to the Nisqually, and they invited all the tribal leaders for a feast. It was certainly understood that there would be discussions. There was no sort of knowledge that there would be, that they'd be signing a treaty. And certainly within how we understood how treaties work, that is something that takes a long time, days and days and days of discussion, of back and forth. This all makes sense, right? This did not make sense. So what Stevens did was he read the treaty first to the audience in Chinook jargon. And what's Chinook jargon? Anybody know? Yeah, it's the trade language of the Coast Salish and other, I'm sure equally important Indigenous nations. I just don't know them. Yes, bands of Indians, if you will. Bands of Indians. He read it to them in Chinook jargon. And this is ridiculous for many reasons, one of which is that plenty of people in the audience understood English. Plenty of people in the audience who were settlers could speak Lushootseed, right? We'd had intermarriage for at least 30, 40 years at this point. He chose not to, right? So he read it to him in Chinook jargon, as like all jargons, has about 500 words. So certainly you can't express the details of a treaty in this way, right? So if I was teaching this in the classroom, right, first I would give that background, and then I would move to, I would read it aloud without letting them see it, and I would give them all a map of the Washington Territory. And then if we look at the second, the Article 1 of the Medicine Creek Treaty, they would then be required to mark on the map of Washington Territory where all these points are while I read it to them. And again, maybe Stevens was a really bad writer, but it's the said tribes and bands of Indians hereby cede, relinquish, and convey to the United States all their right, title, and interest in and to the lands and country occupied by them, bounded and described as follows, to wit, commencing at the point on the eastern side of Admiralty Inlet, known as Point Polly, about midway, one of my favorite phrases, about midway, I guess, between Commencement and Elliott Bays, thence running in a southeasterly direction, why not, following the divide between the waters of the Puyallup and Duwamish, or White Rivers, to the summit of the Cascade Mountains, thence southerly along the summit of said range, to a point opposite the main source of the Skookumchuck Creek, thence to and down said creek to the coal mine, thence northwesterly to the summit of the Black Hills, thence northerly to the upper forks of the Satset River, thence northeasterly through the portage known as Wilkes Portage to point southward on the western side of Admiralty Inlet, thence around the foot of Ashens Island, easterly and southeasterly to the place of beginning. So you can see students immediately would be like, there's absolutely no way, right, as we write it. And then I would have them read it. They'd get to see the actual language, and again, try to find those points on the map of, again, Puyallup territory, which is vast. And then I make them all go outside, and they have to see where exactly they are in relation to this map, right? Where they are in terms of Washington territory. Puyallup territory. And then we could have the students come back in and write on the map their findings, their experiences, how that brought to them and made them understand sort of what that Indigenous loss is, I guess is what I want to say, right? When they can feel themselves within that Indigenous space, and that brings in most of, not only does it prioritize the sovereignty of this land, it also brings in all of the different teaching methods that I spoke about, right? Except mentorship, the most difficult one. Yes, I think that is sort of the end of what I had to talk about. 45 minutes, exactly. Do you have any questions? Ellen?
Curious, we did some meetings around Tacoma,
Mm-hmm.
and we lead a lot of these meetings by recognizing that these lands were usually Puyallup land.
Yes.
What do you think about that as historical class?
I don't do land recognition because it's inappropriate for me to do it on my land, but that's why I try to speak in Lushootseed. Land recognition, I think, I do like it. It makes me a little bit. I want to, it's like I sort of briefly mentioned. It's just it just has to be so historicized within like this contemporary moment, right? That this is this was the land of the Puyallup. That this is the land of the Puyallup, and should be followed up, I think, with a lesson, at least on this, like, why is it no longer in the hands of the Puyallup? And of course, that's obviously books and books, but I think that a brief discussion can follow that. Only once, right? And you can still do land recognition after that, but just because again, like if dehistoricizing American Indians is, I just had this talk with my students today when we were talking about Vine Deloria's The Real and the Unreal. And we've been, we're consistently dehistoricized. We're put outside of what was absolutely a plan, right? Like everything was intentional. It wasn't like the Indians left, and these sort of things, right? So I just think land recognition needs to be, deeply historicized, if that helps. Any other questions? Yes?
I'm Ann Toffin, Urban Studies. I appreciate so much your contextualizing within pedagogical methods to kind of open up the classroom. My question is about how those of us who have been produced and formed in a settler and colonial society can, in fact, try to raise issues of indigeneity in the classroom without reinscribing the harms and the language and the presumption of settler dominance that I have to admit is part of the way that I've been constructed as an individual and socially. And I can say that I have stepped in it inadvertently, right? That I will think that and the reason I knew this treaty is that I teach waterfront development, I research waterfront development, and you can't start to investigate those issues in this region if you have any interest in history, which hopefully a lot of us do, without realizing, wow, there's a huge history here, and it's not really sufficiently written about or made present. So in my efforts to try to bring more to the fore, I realize that sometimes perhaps I do more harm or I reoffend. And so I'm curious what advice you might have for someone like me who I hope is being truthful when I say I want to do my part to try to create Indigenous spaces in the classroom, but I may be unaware of the ways in which I'm reproducing the culture that I'm a part of.
I think that's a great question. I would say that, I myself feel at times complicit, right? And certainly I was raised in I had a very strong oral storytelling tradition growing up. But of course my main source of education is going to be the 5 public school system. And I think that, so just personally, like what my advice would be as a student is like don't ask your Indigenous students, right? If they feel that they can talk, then they will, right? But don't seek them out, which I think is something that at one point is a respectful gesture, right? But at the same time, it's a we become these sort of, the historical burden and privilege of being Indigenous often means that you're ashamed because the knowledge has been taken from you, right? And you're already sort of always trying to like prove your identity and your indigeneity. I do think that you can talk about indigeneity from the settler colonial perspective and say like these are the things that settler colonialism did, right? And that is, I think that's actually something that really needs to happen more, right? Is like this is not this was the effect on Indians. This is settler colonialism. This is the way it was manifested in these like 3 different ways, right? Like I think that settlers need to own that a bit more than they do. Yes, Mark.
So I also really appreciated the, sorry, thanks. appreciated the incorporation of kind of pedagogical techniques, and I'm thinking then about shifting it to evaluation. Right? Are there ways of incorporating evaluation in from an Indigenous perspective that is unique, right? Is something that is specific.
That's a great question, and I guess I can only think of how I evaluate my own students, which I've never really considered in terms of an Indigenous perspective. But is that the questions that they are asked on their tests are about their knowledge. So it's not reciting facts. It's so a typical question for my 100 level Indigenous Studies class would say like, what is tell me a moment of Indigenous resistance and why this is Indigenous resistance. So sort of depending upon them to define the terms and to bring their own knowledge into the space. It's sort of allowing a pretty broad answers. Like oftentimes, like my students will repeat stories that I've told them into the classroom. Like just stories about like my family and everything, and they'll use that as like a moment of Indigenous resistance, which I adore. And I don't care that much. Like I guess this is the other thing. Like my classes are sort of they work in such a way that that in class. They have to do in-class worksheets. They have to discuss their worksheets, and then they have like a final project presentation and these sort of things. So if they aren't there, if they aren't part of the community, they'll end up just sort of not doing well in the class. So I don't know if that helps. Ariana?
So my question is related, but what do you do with those students who don't value this form of knowledge production and this approach, right? Because I find that in my own approach, this is a challenge. The students who find kind of a more traditional academic approach super rewarding for them, or they really want it, whether or not they do well with it. Like,
Yes.
How do you manage those students?
The students who want pat answers to everything. And they get upset. Yeah, I generally just say like, I'm pretty enthusiastic. I'm like, I know that you have the answers, and I really trust you to do your best. And I got a student right there. Now I feel like I need to. But you're kind of a traditional student, but you did very well in my classes.
Absolutely. Yeah. I guess, having the answers sort of the deal. As you said, like having the correct response was sort of important, but also kind of feeling that it was okay to look beyond the answers that you just knew. Like, yes, you could circle the right choice at the multiple choice test, but
I've never done a multiple choice
No.
test, but okay, I'll let it go, Sam.
So like you knew the treaties, you knew why things happened, but there's that comfort of going, all right, now that I know all these things, what can I explore on my own to do? So even just knowing it, encouraging people to look beyond, I think was what really spoke to me.
Okay, thank you, Sam, very much. Yes, Bonnie?
I'm not sure, but have you ever taught online? I feel like you have.
You know what, I'm doing a bit of a hybrid this quarter. I'm not super happy with it.
Yeah.
I've done sort of like maybe every quarter where 4 or 5 of the classes are online, and those are it's not really online, it's more like a very activity-based learning that I'm like, you need to go, so like one of the things this quarter, like they all had to go to the welcoming figure, right, and like touch it. And that makes everybody really uncomfortable. They're like, is that okay? Is it sacred? I'm like, well, yeah, but sacred doesn't mean like in a museum, right? Sacred means like come to it with the right spirit and stuff. And then I'm really freaking them out. So that would be like, that's generally how I've done it, where it's like you have to go and, and do these 3 things or do this. It's outside sort of stuff that then they can manage in their own way, because sometimes I do worry about doing too much stuff outside for students that might have like invisible disabilities.
Yeah, so my follow-up was going to be, what are some tools, but you gave us some.
Yeah, I think that those are the best tools. I'm not 100% on board with it yet. I don't know if I will be. Mike, is that your name? Just kidding.
I was at the Race and Pedagogy Conference where you and a panel of people.
Yes.
It was great.
That was
and it
really
went
fun.
for 2.5 hours, as I recall.
We made space.
Yeah, just made the space. Almost every panel, probably every panel, I think, at that conference started with acknowledging that this was formerly all Puyallup,
Yes.
territory. And so I think that they consciously did that. They made that part of the conference.
Yes.
And so that's one step. Another thing that is also challenging for teaching is that we all have to learn this history, because if we don't know it, we can't really help the students be aware. And it's complicated. And so when we started this campus, we wanted a Native American Studies program. It took us all these years to finally get one. And I think it's going to help transform the way we teach, because it sort of challenges us to really learn this story. And it's not simple. It takes scholarship like what you're doing and Michelle's doing to make it something that we can really use as teachers.
Yeah, I agree. Well, and Mike and I are actually writing a book on local history, but and I'm writing a separate book on the Medicine Creek Treaty. But I agree. Like, I know that a lot of us, that knowledge has been erased for all of the reasons, right? It certainly still exists in our oral storytelling, and I just think that even if you don't know that specific history, there's no reason, you can't implement a lot of these Indigenous teaching methods, right? So Indigenous students will respond at least to that, even if you don't know the specific histories. And if you have the space, right, hopefully the students will be able to bring that into the classroom, right, in so many different ways.
Hi, Danica, this is Patrick. I really appreciate what you tell us, and it's fascinating. It's so good that before I came to UW, I know nothing about anything about Indigenous people, because I'm from a different country. But I learned so much, and glad you're here, and Michelle here. There are a lot of things that I continue to want to learn more about it. Maybe we should someday have a intellectual house like Seattle, or the Longhouse in Evergreen here. Those are space that you talk about, that we need that kind of space, really large and empty, and not with just kind of chairs and so on. But my question really is related to a lot of what they ask. And you mentioned, it's great that we have 2%. Then the national average is 1% of students that are Indigenous people on our campus. This is great. And you mentioned about your tribe, Puyallup tribe, that 5,000 people, we can attract more. But what about other tribes that, do we have any data of other tribes also coming to our campus, like Nisqually and Sterud and so on? And also, what I'm also thinking is that like Anne asked, I don't know if I say the wrong thing, how do I teach? But among the tribes, are there things that are useful for one tribe, but they also have differences? There are a lot of commonalities that you talk about. I'm dealing with other ethnic groups and races, and we're trying to desegregate data that way. And because different tribes have points with the governments and United States government and want different type of treaties. They are not all the same. Alaska, in Canada, they are somewhat different. I spoke with a lot of people. So do I need to be careful if I teach or do that? And also, Mark, you're smiling, even for your assessment, evaluation, is there things that there are taboos or something that are among the tribes that there are differences? Are there any people that looking at that, or we just say all the things you said is all commonality is good enough? But do we need to, in a way, desegregate data to the point that you know how to teach them or evaluate them as well?
I think, well, there was a lot of questions. I'll try to remember. As you can probably, might shock you, UW-T has low data on this sort of stuff. What I know from my students, I would say probably, I think we have like 140 students that are more or less American Indian. And it's weird with American Indian, with the way the data is collected, because to be American Indian, you have to check only that box. So like, you couldn't say that you're, African American and American Indian. It's going to go to African American, just because of the desire to erase our people from this earth, I suppose. But so that's, and that's also very problematic for our students who don't want to erase part of their either Indigenous and or other ethnic part of themselves. In terms of, pretty much for like the lower Coast Salish, those commonalities are going to be across the board, and even to the Coast Salish and more generally. Certainly then once you start spreading out, there's going to be a lot of differences. For myself, when I'm talking about commonalities across Indigenous nations, I do it with underneath the rubric of federal settler colonialism. So, this is what we all have in common, is that we're all peoples under settler colonialism, under a very specific branch of law of the U.S. government. And so there are those commonalities, which is really cool, because once what starts happening, right, in the 1960s, is those commonalities start making sort of pan-Indian resistance movements, and that's what like sort of AIM was born out of and stuff. So, that's where I would go, and this is also why I use the term American Indians, because it's a reminder of settler colonialism, because that's American Indian federal law. And then you get as nation specific as you can, right? So Puyallup to American Indian, if that helps. Yes, James?
Danica, phenomenal presentation.
Oh, thank you.
And I was also at the Race and Pedagogy Institute too, went to the panel.
Did you see the all Puyallup panel?
I did,
That was
mind blown.
It was really good. There was just like 6 or 7 of us, and we were supposed to go for, I'm sorry, James, to interrupt you, but I was so excited about it. It was so much fun. It went we were supposed to talk, I think, for 75 minutes, and we talked for like 2.5 hours. I mean, like, some of the elders just like settled in. And
well, and the entire audience just stayed in their seats the entire time. Yeah. So again, thanks for your presentation. And I guess I was interested in learning about, like, after the class is done, how do we go about facilitating continued engagement, right, for students around issues related to indigeneity? And then also, how do we help them become more efficacious in their ability to dismantle settler colonial kind of practices that show up in many different ways, in ways which earlier we say are invisible? Are there pathways, things that we connect our students to, that you've connected students to, that you think can continue that ongoing learning and engagement around this work?
That's a fantastic question. I'm really hoping that the Chancellor's Diversity Office will be taking care of that.
I just needed you to say that. Yeah.
But I do think this is why the Puyallup Council pushed for the Indigenous liaison position, is because this was something that was coming to me so often that is unfair to our students, right? Like, I can't do this kind of work on top of the work that I do. And so, I think that it needs to be this, we need a dedicated person to do these sort of structural integrations, and I'm excited about this. We're in the process of hiring. I have to give you my feedback, an Indigenous liaison, which is going to be great. Yes, Rachel?
Wow, that was just fantastic, Danica. I learned so much, and I just want to minor in American Indian Studies after this talk. So first, thank you. I just learned so much, and just feel extremely humbled by just learning from you. And my question is really about, I really appreciate your focus on the classroom and pedagogy. But I'm thinking like Dr. Mache about institutions, right? So you talked a lot about representation. You and Dr. Montgomery are the only 2 American Indian faculty, and like staff. How many do we have on this campus? None?
As far as I know, none.
And
Oh yeah, we have, of course, we have Lisa and Lisa. Actually, we have 2 Lisas.
But only a few, right? And I don't
Right.
see anyone on leadership. So I'm just curious about your thoughts about, there's many things you talked about, representation, the hidden curriculum, unlearning, but what else, like as a campus, do we need to do to really, right, decolonize our space and to make this, right, aligned with what you're talking about, right? Just at the institutional level.
Well, I talk about this a lot with my students, and when I first came here, there was a lot of talk about bringing more Indigenous art to the campus, and I was really pushing back against that because I'm uninterested in Indigenous art without the sovereignty as the sort of primary part of the conversation. I think that we are definitely getting to a point now, especially with the minor. It's pretty popular, and especially with the work Michelle and I do, of bringing art to campus, right? My students have proposed a couple examples, and many students have often talked to me about also bringing Lashute to campus. So actually, putting signs in Lashute and everything. For those of you that have been here during the summer when we have the Lashute Language Institute, which will be back again this summer, I'm so excited. Students sort of start spontaneously covering different parts of the campus in Lashute. So you'll go to the bathroom and it'll be like, how to wash your hands in Lashute and stuff. It's so fun. So I think those are 2 sort of small ways. And of course, most of our students aren't, probably a large percentage of our Indigenous students are going to be Coast Salish. They probably won't recognize Lashute, but what they'll recognize is that this is an Indigenous space, right? So I think that those are incorporating Lashute and incorporating a type of contemporary Indigenous art is a step that will sort of students will sort of start to recognize themselves. I do think. One of the things that's been on my mind is that we need to turn a lot of the UW media. There's really no Indigenous representation on any of our pamphlets and that sort of thing. So students need to be able to see themselves. But I agree. Obviously, I would love it if we had more faculty. That's probably would be the most effective thing that we could do for our students. Pardon? And leadership, yeah. Yes, Leanne?
Oh, hi. I had a question. I remember when I visited your class when we were in Teaching Squares, you made a really funny joke about colonial time or something, colonization of time or something. Yeah. And I was just wondering, is the time, could you say something about time in the classroom in relation to that other list that we discussed earlier? So movement and going outside and stories. Is there an Indigenous practice that around time, or is it more embedded in all those other practices?
Yeah, I mean, I do make a lot of jokes about settler colonial time, and maybe Rachel and I have actually made them. We're just colonial time says. But I would say that, this is actually when my students get really worried about dates and stuff, and I'm I was well, actually, that's where I bring in settler colonial time and talk about these are constructions meant to enable the erasure of my people is the answer I give whenever I don't really know what to say. But it's true. But it is true, right? Settler colonialism is a time construct. So yes, it works really well with that. So dates are sort of unimportant to me, as is sort of because time isn't linear, right? Or for us, time isn't linear. Time is a circle. It's more of a circle, kind of a spiral, right? And if you don't think that that's what's happening right now politically, right? It's everything's a spiral. So yeah, I don't know if that answered your question, but anybody else? Yes, Jim.
I just want to, something I observed last week. We went to a conference on the Squaxin territories. They run the South Sound Science Symposium every year, or they host it basically. And it's a really interesting way because it basically puts them at the center of all the science and things that's all that end of things that's going on in South Sound. which it kind of needs to be, because they're usually, I find that especially in the South Sound, Squaxins or the Nisquallies tend to know most of everything that's going on science-wise, and because all the other things are broken up into these weird jurisdictions where people don't actually know the whole picture because they're not allowed to. And I find the same thing actually in the Puyallup system, the Puyallups, and to a lesser extent the Muckleshoots. Really, I mean, they're the people that actually know what's going on, but yet they've never been the center of like science in this region, right? Does that make sense?
They're not. I mean, they're not the center for Western science in the region. Yeah.
Right. But I think that's where it would be really interesting from that standpoint of sort of creating space where people learn, is that I think there's a different take on it. You can kind of feel that in the room when you bring everybody to the Squaxin facility, because then it's kind of built around them, and they're the people that are controlling and organizing and such, even though people help to put this together. And I kind of wonder why can't we do something similar here, where it's, there's hopefully plenty of space somewhere nearby, but it would be nice for that kind of thing, instead of happening at the Center for Urban Waters, it would be nice if it happened at some place that was actually recognized as Puyallup home, and because it centers around the work that they do and the stuff that they manage and the knowledge that they have, not around what we construct, it seems. So it would be interesting to be able to bring, because my students got a lot out of being in a place like that, because there were also presenters that did more of it kind of threw people off, throw scientists off to not have a PowerPoint. And so to have people get up there and tell a story about the work that they were doing was really powerful to the people that were in the room, and also because it stood out from every other PowerPoint that we saw. So it would be interesting to see more of that incorporated, so that students can see how you tell science from that standpoint.
And I 100% agree. And my elders, the Puyallup Tribe, Puyallup Tribal Council, they want me to do like 3 things, right? And that's like write a Puyallup history, they want the Lushootseed Language Institute, and they also want me to, they want the STEM classes, they want more Indigenous scientists, right? And whether or not they want scientists who understand indigeneity, they would prefer Indigenous scientists, right? But they would like this incorporation as much as possible. It's the most important thing that we need, that we have in very limited quantities. And so that is my gift to you, Jim. You get to do that. So I definitely agree, and the Puyallup tribe absolutely agrees. And that is just doing it. Anybody else? All right, thank you.